people shut you down when you immediately make connections. And they've been taught to do this by example, not because they've thought through why there's actually no connection. But the reality is that today, if you're familiar with the historical development of the arguments for homosexuality over the past 50 years, then you know that those who are promoting intergenerational love are using the exact same arguments that were being used by homosexuals 50 years ago. If you don't know what intergenerational love is pedophilia. Adults engaging in sexual behavior, which of course they will say is loving sexual behavior with minor children. That's intergenerational love. And we already have those within the psychiatry community who are drawing the parallels, making the arguments that this needs to be removed from the DSM and, it needs to be seen as that's the way these people were born. These are natural proclivities. The same thing with polygamy, the same thing with bestiality. All of these things, we just need to grow past and recognize that these things are acceptable. Everybody gets to define their own moral plane, except that, maybe stealing or something, because I don't want you to take my Mac from me or something along those lines. It is absolutely fair to point out that, especially toward the end of this presentation, as Matthew Vines is berating Christians for adding suffering to the life of gay Christians, that kind of argumentation is already being used for almost every kind of moral overthrow of God's commandments. And that needs to be kept in mind. And then you need to examine, is there a foundation for differentiating the homosexual argument from these others who are using the same argument? And if so, what is it? And is it just because I've heard homosexuals say, I'm offended when you do that. Well, I imagine you are. But what's the basis for your offense? Can you provide, but they're not young enough to make that kind of decision, or they're not old enough to make that kind of decision. That sounds like a rather arbitrary thing. And so keep that in mind as you listen to this, as it develops, and we'll see that.
Within this framework, gay people have a problem, and that is that they want to have sex with the wrong people. They tend to be viewed as essentially lustful sexual beings. So while straight people...
Now, let me just mention, again, one of the reasons we need to hear this is that Matthew Vines is presenting the monogamous, long-term, committed concept of homosexuality, which is almost never experienced by a homosexual. While, sadly, long-term monogamous marriages are now in the minority, we all know those glorious cases, those glorious couples we see who've been married 50 and 60 and 70 years. But the vast majority of homosexual expression in our society and historically, and this will even be substantiated by some of the arguments he himself makes later on, but the vast majority of homosexual experience is not monogamous. It's not based upon long-term commitments or anything of the kind. And unfortunately, once again, all one has to do is do just a little bit of digging on the internet to see the real public face of homosexuality, which is not the face that Matthew Vines is putting on it here, which means it is a multifaceted movement. And he may well say, I'm not talking about that kind of homosexuality, but if he's going to say that, then he needs, I think, to come out and condemn that kind of homosexual behavior. But the problem is, on what basis are you going to condemn it? Because once you start making those kinds of judgments, what's the foundation upon which you're standing, et cetera, et cetera?
Fall in love, get married, and start families. Gay people just have sex. But everyone has a sexual orientation, and it isn't just about sex. Straight people are never really forced to think about their sexual orientation as a distinctive characteristic.
That's because there is a natural sexual orientation and there is an unnatural one. And he's going to go through, Paul and does not even nature tell you long hair and try to get away from the fact that the Bible can actually talk about the fact that because God has created in a particular fashion, that there is a necessary natural function of the male and the female. He's gonna use that way to get around that, as if the Bible ever once uses the term nature in some other way, then there cannot be any transcendent use. There cannot be anything that flows from the fact that one of the biggest themes in all of Scripture is the reality that God's the creator of all things, and therefore he determines what is natural and right for all things through his creative decree. But that really, really, really needs to be kept in mind.
But it's still a part of them, and it affects an enormous amount of their lives.
By the way, I forgot what I was going to comment about there. Over and over again in this presentation, Matthew Vines is going to talk about his desire to start a family. Again, it's easy to say, well, you could do that if you wanted to, but you see, due to the nature of the created order, there's only one way to do that. Two men cannot start a family. I mean, would there be any meaningful argumentation to someone who is complaining and saying, God isn't treating me correctly, and I'm not able to truly fulfill my true desires because I want to be married to my German Shepherd, and I want to start a family with my German Shepherd, but I can't. Well, why can't you? Well, because God didn't create it to work